Hello, welcome to Ashianti's Art Answers. Today we have a new topic. It is the Pre-Raphaelites. So we've got some questions that were sent in and let's take a look. So the first question, Dear Ashianti, just wondering if there were any styles of art that the Pre-Raphaelites followed? Thanks. Yes, they did. The group followed the art of the late medieval Europe and early Renaissance Europe and sought to create a new British art. Hey, the next question. Hey Ashianti, I read that the Pre-Raphaelites were a brotherhood. How many members were there? Are there any main members? There were several members of the group, and the most well-known members were William Holman Hunt, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and John Everett Millais. The group was formed around 1848 and unofficially disbanded around 1853, even though some members of the group still continued to use the name. Our next question. Hi there, Ashianti. Were there any other movements that were occurring when the Pre-Raphaelites began? Actually, there was right around the end of another movement is when the Pre-Raphaelites began. The movement was called the Chartism movement. This was a movement developed by the working class. The participants wanted to gain political rights and to have more of a say in their society. Next question. Hello, Ashianti. I know that many artists use symbolism or their works follow a theme. Are there any for the Pre-Raphaelites? Yes, there were. In conjunction with their surrounding influences, much of the work of the Pre-Raphaelites depicted issues such as moral injustice, like the portrait in the top left corner, piety, like the portrait in the top right corner, familial relationships, like the portrait in the bottom left corner, and the struggle of purity against corruption, like the portrait in the bottom right corner. And we can take a closer look at the symbolism and themes of these portraits, and also talk a little bit about the stories and backgrounds of these portraits. So the first portrait we saw, it's an oil painting by William Holman Hunt. It has a long title, it's on the side. You can see that there's concerned and saddened soldiers surrounding a young man's body, which gives off the aura of purity and its lightness compared to the shading of the other men all around and in the background. Hunt's depiction of the historical scene pushes the viewer, as he would have hoped, to acknowledge the spiritual moment behind the realism. This portrait is called In the Light of the World by William Holman Hunt as well. This portrait actually has a lot of symbolism in it. For example, the figure in the middle is supposed to be Jesus, and he's preparing to knock on a door. The door is shown to have a lot of plants growing on it, as though it's not been opened in a long time. And the door also has no handle, so it can only be opened from the inside, representing a closed mind. The third painting is Ophelia by John Everett Millais. It's a remake of Ophelia's death from Shakespeare's Hamlet. The model, Elizabeth Siddal, who would later be wife to Rossetti, is depicted as Ophelia. What's interesting is that she was required to pose over a 4-month period in a bath full of water, kept warm by lamps underneath. Some symbolism are the willow, nettle, and daisy. They're associated with forsaken love, pain, and innocence. The pansies refer to love in vain. There's violets, which Ophelia wears in a chain around her neck, which stands for faithfulness. And the poppies signify death, and forget-me-nots, which are pretty obvious. They float in the water around her. The last photo is titled Isabella, and it was John Everett Millais' first work created in the Pre-Raphaelite style. Millais used distorted perspective and angular poses, which are characteristic of medieval art. This portrait describes the relationship between Isabella, the sister of the wealthy medieval merchants that you can see sitting around, and the employee of Isabella's brother, which is shown sitting next to her. It depicts the moment at which Isabella's brothers realize that there is a romance between the two young couple, and they plot to murder the employee so that she can be married off to a wealthy nobleman. Isabella is being handed a blood orange on a plate by the employee, and what's cool is that each of the plates has a distorted picture glazed onto its surface, and the initials PRB are seen etched onto the side of her bench. Another question. Dear Ashianti, What marks did the Pre-Raphaelites leave behind? Well, by the 1860s, the group was no longer together, and much of their art shifted to individual portraits of mostly women, specifically Dante Rossetti, whose most praised qualities were his aesthetic ability and his ability to turn portraits into poetry. Dante and other Pre-Raphaelite members and friends popularized the aesthetic movement in the 1860s. Other themes and styles emerged from the aesthetic Pre-Raphaelitism, such as the arts and crafts movement, modern function and design, and aesthetics and decadence. Okay, so our final question is a special request. It reads, Hello, Ascianti. Dante Gabriel Rossetti has a lot of beautiful pieces. Could you talk a little bit about some of his pieces? Here we have Dante's first oil portrait, which is also the first portrait to be exhibited with the initials PRB for Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The Virgin Mary is shown here as a young girl working on an embroidery with her mother. Her father is pictured in the background pruning a vine. The picture is actually full of a lot of symbolic symbols, like the branch on the floor and the thorny briar rose on the wall, which allude to Christ's passion. And the books on the floor also have different names on them, like virtues of hope, faith, and charity. The dove represents the Holy Spirit. It's a religious piece with a nice Renaissance feel, with the people being positioned off to the side, but also front and center. And in this oil painting by Dante, Proserpine is depicted as the Empress of Hades. The pomegranate depicts the fruit she is forbidden to eat, and the reason why she is enchained to her new destiny. She is represented walking by in a gloomy quarter of her palace. The light shown in the portrait as she passes represents the upper world that she cannot return to, and she looks to be deep in thought about it. It's a really pretty piece. You can see the waves in her hair and the defining features of her body and her gown. It's really nicely done. And so the last piece I'll talk about is Dante's Beata Beatrice. It's a portrait made in remembrance of his late wife Elizabeth, but it's also a depiction of the poet Dante's beloved Beatrice in Vita Nuova. Its hazy quality gives the sensation of a dream or vision. Elizabeth, or Beatrice, is posed as in spiritual ecstasy. The dove, off to the right, depicts the Holy Spirit with an opium poppy in its beak, which depicts the reason for Elizabeth's death, which was a drug overdose. The sundial off to the right also shows the time of Elizabeth's death. Both the dove and the figure of love in the background are in red, which signifies passion. And the figure of love is shown holding a small flame in her hand, which represents Elizabeth's flickering life. It's really a meaningful, passionate, beautiful piece, and it's one of my favorites of Rossetti's. So we explored some really beautiful pieces and influential artists, and we had some great questions. Thank you guys for listening, and see you next time.